Welcome everyone to our session 15 Q&A session with our speakers from the last session. So I think it looks like we're just waiting for one more of our speakers who probably got lost on the way here. Virtual conferences do suffer from some of the same issues as non-virtual conferences, as you still can't find the right room. It just happens to be a Zoom link you can't find. So I hope everyone's having a wonderful FACT conference so far. And yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Josh and Wanik Cho for joining us. I was going to wait 2 seconds until we get Ari, who clearly got lost on the way here. But I think maybe we can dive in with some of the questions that have come up. And I think I'll start with questions to go in reverse until Ari gets here. Because I like making sure that we don't follow the pre-described order for no apparent reason. So Wanik Cho, we have a question from one of the FACT volunteers that says, we've got Ari. Welcome, Ari. How is this an important problem for today's large-scale language models? So I assume it's in relation to the kind of cross-lingual gender bias work. How is that important for today's large-scale language models?
Well, as you know, today we have many NLP models available from service providers or provided from academia that uses large amount of data or large amount of parameters available, but sometimes they are not fairly checked with the potential harms, and so that they can have some kind of unexpected offensive action to the end users that some may feel offensive for the results that they have not expected or they are not even aware of in some translation models. So we thought that it is the main factor our research can be deemed as an ethical issue, which can really affect the end users in the real world. And that is why our research is related with technical properties, but also have relation to the ethics. It is our explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to follow that up. I noticed in the paper it looks like you were evaluating in-house models. So I think you had Amazon was there, and there were 2 others. And we have a question on how, is there some sort of comparison between kind of the evaluation on these public machine translation models and how what happens with the in-house trained models?
Oh, yeah, we only checked in the paper with the publicly available models such as Yandex, Bing, and Amazon. And we have faced with the comments that they are not actually related with the models that if we collect the data and train it, then it may be more explainable and more transparent than the public models available. But we thought that those 2 are not completely separated, because many companies or service providers use the open resources they can use in their training as much as possible, as I know. And it is one factor I thought those 2 are not completely separated. And also if we train and evaluate the trained model, these models are not really the ones that can reach the end users. So that is the limitation of the circumstances we train our own module, because we don't have platforms to make a user study, as you know, in many schools or other small companies don't have such platform to provide the service that can, if they can check if the models can really affect or make offensive the end users. And so that's why we chose the public models for the investigation.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to round off. So we're going to go backwards. So my next question I'm gonna direct to Josh, and it comes from Glenn Cora. And Glenn Cora asks, could you use frequency of habitual B or other vernacular constructs to estimate the number of AA speakers in the other corpi? Corpora? Corpi.
Yeah, I think that we couldn't do that for 100% sure. When we talk about African American English and the linguistic features held therein, there's not a direct correlation between about the racial identity of the speaker. It is most often the case that a speaker of African American English, or rather a speaker who exhibits or utilizes the linguistic features that are found in African American English, will be African American. But other peoples of other ethnicities or races could also grow up in environments where African American English is being utilized, and can kind of grow up with their language acquisition experience utilizing those linguistic features as well. Also, just to give a bit of nuance that I kind of mentioned in the paper, is that not all African Americans speak African American English. Many don't. Many have a swath or fall on a spectrum of African American English linguistic features, and will use it in various situations, which is commonly known as code switching. However, so having said all of that, it is a way that we could start to get at the question of how many we could estimate how many African American English speakers there are in each corpus. I don't know that I would feel fully comfortable saying there are this many Black speakers or this many African American speakers in the corpus, but African American English speakers, then we could definitely do that much better. And so, for example, with Fisher, the Fisher corpus, you can, as you see in my paper, it is the closest one to Chorale, which has the second highest number of habitual B instances in it. And it has a pretty decent amount, not relative to its size, but in terms of just raw count, it does. And so we could, as I've researched, and even as I just read through the concordance slides themselves and saw the other grammatical constructions that were in those concordance lines, would lead me to believe this person is likely a speaker of African American English, and does so pretty regularly. So we could take, for example, okay, which speakers have these features, habitual B or other grammatical features within African American English features, and say, yeah, this speaker is in all probability a speaker of African American English, and we could estimate it that way. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that definitely answers the question. Another one for you, Josh. We've got one from Ted Peterson. Ted Peterson is one of my conference buddies. In my first online conference, Ted got a bunch of us all beginners together and made sure we were okay. And Ted asks, did you look at the context in which habitual B was used? Was it found in direct quotes, dialogue, narrative, or any patterns like that? If you notice such patterns, does that provide any insight onto what be might good sources of speech corpora for AE, or any ideas in related to that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, it's one that kind of I've been thinking about a lot lately. So, Switchboard, or as I examined it, the combination of Switchboard and Hub5, and Fisher are both corpora that are conversational corpora. They were constructed essentially. The researchers took a computer system and had people sign up, and the people received a random call from the computerized system that connected them to another participant, and then gave them a topic to talk about. They talked for a certain amount of minutes. It recorded the conversation and took down the transcripts. I think that is a great way to capture a feature like habitual B. Because habitual B, for example, is all about a habitual action, a present thing. If, for example, if you are talking about maybe an oral history interview, even if a person is a speaker of African American English and does have habitual B in their linguistic repertoire, it may not show up that much because they're talking about the past tense, right? So there might not be, as you say, a context for that habitual B to show up. So maybe a Switchboard or a Fisher is a better place for that to happen, and that's one thing that we see in Fisher. I would say that Chorale is a good, or the Corpus of Regional African American Language is a good kind of guiding light for us here, because it does have so many instances of habitual B, and it is modeled on a traditional sociolinguistic interview, and those sociolinguistic interviews were kind of born out of William Leboeuf's research. And what they did is they tried to move past the observer's paradox with interviewers, to where often when people are talking to other people and being interviewed, their speech is very guarded, their register is formal because they're nervous. And the social linguistic interview was geared to move people past that into more naturalistic speech, by moving them from very surface level questions to ending up at questions like, tell me about a time you thought you were going to die, or tell me about some childhood games that you played. And it's been very successful across many, many studies. So I think that could be a good guiding light for us moving forward of how to capture more naturalistic occurring linguistic features of African American English. If you turn it to a corpus like LibreSpeech, which is just the read speech of Project Gutenberg books or LibriVox books, it doesn't really happen all that much, even though there's like way more data in that corpus than all the other ones, because it is primarily written speech that's being read, and often because of the societal, oppression and malicious feelings towards African American English, those features are not present there. So you're not going to have that. So I think that's an excellent question, and I think Chorale is a great place to look to guide us forward in capturing those features.
Thanks, Josh. I'm assuming Chorale's a much newer data set than the others.
So Chorale in its collected form is newer, but it has the collected work of people from the 60s to the 90s to the early and late 2000s. So it's a fantastic diachronic corpus. And it has a number of regional centers, whether that's in Georgia or New York or Washington, D.C. So it's a really great corpus for getting a good swath of African American populations, both geographically and over time.
Amazing. Yeah, I was interested in that. It looked like as the data sets got older in terms of their curation, the less we knew about that data set in terms of who was there when we gathered it. And just kind of, I think that's a good trend that we're starting to see, that, we're documenting who is in our data sets more. So that's, I thought, was at least positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Emily Bender is doing great work with that, so.
Yes. I see we got another question. I think I'll come around back to that one, and we can go into Ari, and I'm just going to circle back and forth for a bit. Ari, we've got one from Sarah here. Says, thank you for the talk. You note a possible bias injection point at the annotation stage, but through your comments, it seems that you think that this is most likely from crowdsourced amateurs. Could you speak more to the possibility that the annotation task experimental design could be at fault?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I think one of the root causes with annotating hate speech data or annotating tweets in general for kind of harmful content is harmful content is such a subjective category. It's such a subjective notion. There are ways to define harm, and each data set has its own definitions of its different types of harm. So it'll say, we define hate speech as XYZ, and we define abuse as, X prime, Y prime, Z prime. So they've taken these very subjective concepts, defined them because, you have to, if you want to be rigorous, and then they're having somebody annotate the data. So whether that is crowdsourced amateurs, in those cases, they would generally get, 3 to 5 amateurs to annotate and use a plurality or majority rule. We thought that might be more prone to bias because in cases where experts, quote unquote, are doing the annotation, they've undergone pretty intense training or have their annotations reviewed by an outside expert in gender studies or racial relations studies. So there are always going to be problems annotating. And I do think one of the issues with, automating harmful content moderation is that you need to train systems on something, and you need to produce that data by annotating large corpora of tweets for harm. But absolutely, it's the world of second best that we have to annotate this data, and someone has to say at some point in time, I believe that this tweet is hateful. I believe that this tweet is offensive. And there, under our current paradigm, there isn't really a way around that. Even if we were to use kind of the results of moderation on Twitter, that's just another human making these moderation decisions at the end of the day. So like I said, we're living in the world of second best, and one productive question is, how do we make this annotation as fair as possible? And it's been shown that priming annotators for dialectal differences can make the annotations more fair along these racial dialect lines. But it is maybe an interesting parallel question. How can we move away from having to annotate these data and requiring a human making this subjective decision in order to create the data on which these systems train?
Awesome, thanks, Ari. Anyone else, Josh or Juan, want to chime in on that point? I'll take some shaking of the heads as a no. Then I'll do a follow-up one, Ari, from Tao. And they're asking, are there limitations or bias already in the model predicting, and then it's P_AAE, so it's probability of underscore AAE. What would be some effects of them, if any, on your finding? Example, it would make it stronger, weaker, etc.
Absolutely. It's one of the things we struggled with, and it's one of the things we wrote about, although probably more briefly than we could have and should have, is that, right, a lot of our analysis depends on getting these PAAE, which is the predicted African-American English alignment of a tweet. But again, that's predicted by an automated model. And then using those predictions to run bias analyses on the harmful content detection models that we've trained. And right, from the get-go, you kind of think about, okay, if there are problems, biases, inconsistencies in this dialect alignment model, then any bias there will be compounded and could have downstream effects. So one thing that I've thought about is the dialect alignment model was trained using US Census data, and it's essentially using kind of demographic trends by region along with this massive tweet corpus, I think 60 million tweets that are geotagged to determine these dialectal properties. And they've then run some nice rigorous analyses that show that their dialect model follows well-known linguistic phenomena, and there's reason to believe that this is a pretty good model, but it's not a perfect model, safe to say that. And so when you get these dialect predictions that may be imperfect, and then you're using that as kind of a ground truth in this round 2 of evaluation, that could be problematic. One thing that I've thought about is there are some specific kind of forms of profanities that are more prevalent in African American English than in Standard American English. And if those, those specific words drastically increase a tweet's predicted African American English alignment, and also maybe increase the prevalence that it is labeled a certain way in these harmful tweet data sets, particularly by amateur annotators who have not been kind of trained on these linguistic differences, or even by experts at times, we see that too, then we could have these kind of correlations in the data between African American English alignment, as predicted by this automated model, and harmful labels that are not necessarily the result of a mislabeling or of a conscious bias, but are, parts of this broader system of cultural unawareness and kind of systemic racism that has shaped the landscape of tweets, and then shapes the way annotators think in snap decisions about the tweets that they're tasked with annotating, which of course affects the downstream behavior of these systems.
Is it turtles all the way down?
It is, yeah, unfortunately.
I see there's a lot of nods coming from Josh and Wanik. Either of you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, I just really appreciate your work, Ari. And, I was just kind of thinking of the ways that studies have shown that people perceive African American English as more aggressive when it's linguistically and objectively not. It's just perception. And that could definitely, I think, intersect with what you're talking about with, the use of profanity, where in an African American English linguistic kind of construct in a tweet, people just might perceive that as more aggressive because of systemic, and racist attitudes that they maybe don't even know that they have, right? Mainly because of a lack of exposure to speakers of African American English, or not having studied any sort of linguistic, research or data on African American English, and understanding that it's a legitimate systematic and rule governed linguistic variety, rather than whatever societal perception they've been given through the education system, through media, or what have you. So yeah, everything Ari was saying, I was like, yep, yep, totally agree.
Awesome. So I'm going to use my moderator powers to ask a question, and I'm going to start with Wanik Cho, and I want to hear your thoughts on the severe lack of language and dialect diversity in NLP and speech in general, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. And also this is for the entire group, so I'd like to get insights from all of you, because I think that's obviously shaped a lot of the conversations we're having here today, and a lot of your work is this there's an overall lack of studies and expertise and bias in the data sets. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, as I am studying mainly on Korean, and I sometimes I have two kinds of views in my point. As a Seoul Korean user, I feel I am very I have some advantage in having research in Korean itself, because Seoul Korean is the major dialect used in Korean language family. But in other sense, Korean itself is much more understudied in all NLP industry. So I feel some kind of well, so
if I was to think about it, we're speaking in English right now, right?
Yeah,
as a thing, we're speaking to each other in English, which sort of points to, and most of the big conferences which we'll go to will be in English. And I can imagine that impacts like not only you as a researcher, but anyone who's coming from a background where English isn't your first language.
Well, can I continue my words?
Of course.
Yeah. One of the things I face is that there are many language phenomena that are studied in conferences, and there are many annotation guidelines coming out for data construction. But as we want to make data set in our own languages, such as Korean, and submit such data construction phase to the conferences, but sometimes we feel that every single the construction phase of every single language is not treated equally in all the conferences. That's what I sometimes feel, because for example, if as one of my research is on speech act in Korean, and we wrote up the guideline for the speech act classification for Korean from scratch, because it is not that documented well in our language. But it is many, as we submit it to some conferences, it is regarded as a narrow result. That is the expression I've got in some reviews. So I want to point out that even though English or English family is main studied languages in NLP conferences, but I want the overall academic communities to feel the same to the other language families. And well, I don't know if my feeling is conveyed well to the listeners, but that is one of my thoughts in language diversities and dialect diversities in academic conferences.
Thank you. No, I think you conveyed it very well. I certainly share the same sentiment, having suffered the same problems submitting similar works to conferences. It's always interesting when people reply with it's not novel, or it's not SOTA, and it's like, but we're not working in English, or so opening that up to Ari and Josh, what are your thoughts around this?
I was just thinking of a quote from Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology. So she talks about a former Apple employee who was a part of a team that developed speech recognition from Siri. As they worked to improve Siri's ability to comprehend different dialects, an employee asked his boss why they weren't considering African-American English. And the quote is from the boss. To this, the boss responded, "Well, Apple products are for the premium market." And I think that there's a very insidious but revealing tone there to say that African-American English, one, is not understood as a legitimate linguistic variety by many people outside of linguistics, unfortunately. And two, that it is often associated with a lot of negative stereotypes, and in this case, with a lower socioeconomic status. And here we get into the fact that unregulated capitalism propels us to look at the bottom line and say, like, who are the people that are going to be buying this product? Who are the people that are going to have the money to buy this product? And if we have associations about the way that certain a group of people who speaks a certain way and their socioeconomic status, then we will not put our resources there. I think it also kind of is a correlation to our research. We often do the most for the most gain, right? And I often think about the preferential option for the poor, and taking the most marginalized and putting them in the forefront of our mind, them as the first priority. And I think that would be a great model for us as developers and testers and examiners of NLP models and things like that, to think we should be prioritizing those that are most marginalized, those are the most locked out by society first and foremost, and use our tools to lift those groups and folks up, work on those things, and then all tides raise the boats or whatever. But I mean, that's a total radical re-examining of the way that we think about these things and our values and how we go about these things. So I definitely think that they're much deeper issues here that need to be addressed, and all of us, including myself.
Yeah, just jumping right into that. I think a lot of that is really spot on. What both of you were saying. I came across very early in my kind of analyses of the bias in these data sets before you even train any systems. Just what's going on here. I remember we were struggling whether or not we should think of African American English alignment as a continuous variable, or whether we should try to dichotomize and say these tweets are highly African American English aligned. And most of the literature dichotomizes. It says, above 80%, you can call that AAE aligned. And the problem with using that rule in our data sets is that a lot of the data sets had 17 tweets total that by that definition would be African American English aligned. And so that could have been the paper. That's a red flag right there. That these systems that hopefully Twitter itself is using a bigger, more representative data set, but at least maybe not, right? In academic research communities, this is the best we have. And for me to see that and just to see such a clear manifestation of this issue of representation in the data we're using, the data we're training on, our means of communicating at this conference, it tends to be English oriented. It tends to be white English oriented, and that we all lose out from that. I think our systems are not only biased and perpetuate prejudices and kind of perpetuate the system of systemic racism, but they are less generalizable. They are less accurate, So it's interesting for me to think about ways of kind of unifying these ideas, right? You shouldn't be reducing bias at the cost of classification performance or the cost of accuracy, because really reducing bias is more accurately representing a fair world and more accurately representing a world to which we aspire. I think maybe this takes a little of what Josh was talking about, of kind of a radical rethinking of our research practices and our systems of interacting in the world. But to me, that feels like a necessary step.
Got nods all around. Back to some normal questions, not normal questions, non-moderator seated questions. Where we can all have a good rant, and to our volunteer and our audience questions. I've got one for Ari. Why did you choose equal odds as a fairness metric? And can you expand on the relative merits of equal odds versus demographic parity in this context?
Yeah, definitely. So just for those of you who missed the talk, we looked in particular at two definitions of algorithmic fairness: demographic parity, which essentially dictates kind of equality in predictions, or in this case, unconditional independence between dialect and our predicted values. And then we also looked at equal odds, which is kind of a conditional dependence. So it's saying the false positive and false negative rates should be equal across demographic groups. These both felt like important axes on which to look at this problem, on which to evaluate our systems, because I think in the ideal classification system upholds equal odds in the sense that the perfect classifier classifies every harmful tweet as harmful and every benign tweet as benign. And I've kind of already discussed why that's a problematic viewpoint in the first place, because these lines are fuzzy and it's all a little bit subjective. But in classifying perfectly, the ideal classifier would uphold equal odds because it would have no false positives, no false negatives, so it would have a conditional independence, conditional on base rates, on ground truth values between dialect and classifications. But if those base rates are different, if if harm is more prevalent in a certain dialect, which we've assumed ex ante it is not, then the ideal system is not constrained by demographic parity in the same way. So that's kind of the argument for equal odds, that we should have systems that are so good at classifying that they're not misclassifying tweets in any dialect as harmful at a higher rate. The place where that breaks down, it kind of breaks down in two places, in my opinion. The first is that equal odds looks at our gold standard ground truth class labels, and I'm smiling as I say it because that's such a ridiculous idea. We see clear examples of annotation bias, label bias in the data sets that cause some of our gold standard class labels to simply be wrong. So to condition on those values brings in some of the exact same bias we're trying to address here. It doesn't bring all of it because not all of the bias is simple mislabeling. There's also bias in the sense of kind of overall distributions of labels and the way they correlate with dialect in the data sets. But it absolutely does bring some of that bias right into the evaluation, and we would have kind of biased evaluations of the equal odds fairness of our classifiers. So that's one axis on which it could potentially be harmful to over rely on equal odds, and considering demographic parity in parallel, keeps us honest. If a system is showing perfect equal odds fairness, but the demographic parity metrics are totally skewed, we maybe have some pause there and then look into the label bias of that data set. The second reason is a little more nuanced, and that is that even if we train a system that can perfectly classify the held out test set of its training data set, which is kind of our whole paradigm for how we evaluate machine learning models. If the real world looks different, then that system, which upholds equal odds perfectly, might still associate some linguistic properties of one dialect with harm when it shouldn't, right? So there's the second observation that even if our systems are really perfectly tailored and perfectly calibrated for their training data sets and the held out test sets therein, if they're associating any dialect properties, which have nothing to do with harm, with the harmfulness of tweets, then that feels wrong and will almost definitely result in biased predictions. So at a very basic level, there is something really appealing about upholding demographic parity because we can be pretty sure that it's not associating any kind of properties of dialect with harm, and it's rather looking a little deeper. We're kind of forcing it to really tease out what it is about harm that is harmful, rather than just what it is about dialects that it could say is harmful and get rewarded with correct classification.
Awesome, thank you. So I think we got 5 minutes left. So I think we can do kind of final thoughts. Just so the audience members know, please go to the Circle chat and to the authors here, please go join there so you can get any of your final questions answered. We didn't get to all of them, so thank you to the audience for all your questions. And my ending closing question to all of you. First of all, thank you for joining us today. And the question is as follows: what is next? What needs to change now? Let's start with you. Let's start with Josh.
So just kind of hitting on my paper, I would say that there are a few papers out there that are starting to really analyze the speech recognition systems that are out there. But there's, as I said in my paper, there's not really that much going on in investigating the training data, which is likely where a lot of the bias comes from. So, you know, there's African American English is such this beautiful and incredibly complex system, and there's so many aspects of it that need to be analyzed. And you know, I think it would be a great bridge for linguists and computer scientists and, you know, computational linguists on either side of that spectrum to work together to really do some good, to go in and just like look for these things in the same way that I looked for habitual B, but also test systems. Also, you know, like start, you know, maybe creating guidelines or things like that in order for when people develop ASR systems to say, okay, before you even start, you need to check your data sets for these types of things, or you need to be checking if you've already developed, maybe you need to look into the way that the data set that you're using to evaluate your system. Just very concrete steps that are laid out, like checklists that people could use easily to ensure that things like this are being addressed as they both develop and evaluate their systems.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. Nick-Jo, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, in our paper, we mainly dealt with the gender bias issue, but in other view, we think we have some other attributes such as occupation groups or other kinds of gender properties. So in this paper, we concentrated on gender factors since our chosen language pairs regard those kind of properties, but we think this kind of attributes can be expanded to other properties, as I mentioned before, and further step may be mitigation or debiasing methods that can be applied to real trained systems. And that's one of the comments we received in previous submissions. We only make an evaluation because it was itself a very big project. But as a next step, we want to have a real solution for this kind of problems for much more kinds of language pairs that can be investigated.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sonic. And Ari, to wind us off, you've got probably 30 seconds, but I'm sure Ryan will give us an extra 30 seconds.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Jade, by the way, for moderating. It's funny, you asked what needs to change. A lot should change, ideally. I'm kind of thinking on 3 scales here. On the scale of racial dialect bias in harmful tweet detection, I think there's more to do to understand these upstream biases and also to change and improve the way we think about bias and the way we think about evaluating this bias. I really love the idea of a synthetic data set for this purpose. Synthetic data sets are a little easier in some other contexts, like in the context of gender bias. You know, a synthetic data set could be the doctor asked the nurse to stop what he was doing and help her with the operation. And that's a really good way to tell, you know, to tease out bias in your system. It would be quite an undertaking to construct a synthetic data set for you know, these dialectal differences, and I think could be a really fascinating task for linguists and social scientists. So that's one thing. It is kind of improve our understanding of the upstream bias, improve the ways we evaluate this particular type of bias, the racial dialect bias, and then use what we learn there to improve the systems, because these are systems that are in use every day, and it does feel like a priority to make improvements there. Zooming out a little bit, I think it's important to remember that this is just one axis of bias, and these systems have been shown to be biased on a bunch of different levels and against many different kind of marginalized groups in different ways, and that's just the known unknowns, right? There's also all of the bias that we have good reason to exist, but haven't been able to show or haven't thought to look for. And so I think exploring all of those other different biases and opportunities to improve the fairness of these systems and others is a really valuable task. And then kind of at the broadest level, one of the most uncomfortable things for me about thinking about algorithmic bias and algorithmic unfairness is that absolutely automated systems can exacerbate biases and can amplify biases, but at the end of the day, they're reflections of society. A computer has no reason to bias against African American English other than that's what it's seeing in its training data. So any of these questions kind of have to become systemic questions, and it's uncomfortable, but it is an important conversation to have, and I don't think this conversation is complete without talking about what has to change at the deepest, at the broadest, at the most ingrained levels, my home country, the United States, and around the world.
And what a point to leave us off at. This is what I love about FACT, is that all discussions devolve into this. So I'm definitely enjoying the conference. Awesome. Thank you very much to the speakers. Thank you to FACT Conference, and thank you to our session volunteer, Tian Lang. Ling, you haven't seen her. She's been doing work behind the scenes with the questions. And to Ryan, who's the host. And I hope everyone has an excellent rest of, what are we? We're Thursday, and we're Tuesday in some places. I think we're mostly at Tuesday. Maybe some places in the world already on Wednesday.